October 24th, 1944. The Formosa Strait. 2:30 in the morning. Commander Richard O'Kane is standing on the bridge of the USS Tang, watching the wake of his 24th torpedo of the patrol cut a white line across black water toward a stricken Japanese transport. He has fired 23 torpedoes on this patrol. 22 of them hit. It is, at this point in the war, the most effective single war patrol any American submarine has ever conducted. In 2 nights, the Tang has destroyed a convoy of Japanese transport ships carrying reinforcements and supplies for a war effort that is beginning to collapse. O'Kane has personally sunk more tonnage than any other submarine captain in the Pacific Fleet. He has 1 torpedo left. He sees one more target, a crippled Japanese ship, already burning, already sinking, but not yet finished. He orders the last torpedo fired to make certain of the kill. The torpedo leaves the tube. It does not go straight. Submarine torpedoes of this design have a documented flaw, a tendency, under specific and rare conditions, to circle back toward the vessel that fired them. It is a flaw that the U.S. Navy's Bureau of Ordnance has known about in various forms since early in the war. It is a flaw that has been minimized, downplayed, and in some cases actively concealed in official assessments, because acknowledging it would mean acknowledging that the torpedo program, already the subject of a years-long scandal about defective detonators, had a second, separate, and equally dangerous problem. O'Kane watches his own last torpedo turn in the water. It turns 90 degrees. It is now running directly back at the Tang. There are perhaps 20 seconds between firing and impact. O'Kane orders flank speed and a hard turn, trying to outrun a weapon his own ship just launched. It is not enough. The torpedo strikes the Tang's stern. The explosion is catastrophic. The aft third of the submarine, the engine rooms, the maneuvering room, the after torpedo room, floods almost instantly. Men in those compartments do not have time to react. The Tang, the most successful American submarine of the Pacific War at the exact moment of its greatest triumph, begins to sink, struck by its own weapon, in enemy waters, at night, with most of her crew of 87 men. What happened over the next several hours to the men trapped in the forward compartments of a sunken submarine on the floor of the Formosa Strait? To the 9 men who escaped through a flooded escape trunk using an experimental breathing device that had never been tested in real combat conditions? To Richard O'Kane himself, who would spend the rest of the war in a Japanese prison camp being beaten by guards using information about his own ship's effectiveness as justification, is one of the most extraordinary survival stories of the entire Second World War. And the reason most people have never heard it is not an accident. For nearly 2 decades after the war, the United States Navy kept the full details of what caused the Tang's loss officially ambiguous. The Navy's public account attributed the sinking to enemy action or unexplained causes. The internal investigation that established the truth that America's most successful submarine had been sunk by a malfunctioning American torpedo, the 24th and last of an otherwise perfect patrol, was classified. It remained substantially classified for parts of 3 decades. This is the story of the USS Tang, of the torpedo defect the Navy spent years not fixing, of the 9 men who escaped a sunken submarine using equipment nobody expected to actually need, of the captain who survived the sinking, survived the prison camp, and spent decades afterward trying to get the full story told, and of why the United States Navy, for years, preferred silence to the truth about its own weapon. To understand what happened to the Tang, you have to understand what submarine warfare in the Pacific actually was. It was,
by a wide margin, the most dangerous branch of service in the United States military during the Second World War.
The submarine force represented less than 2% of U.S. Navy personnel. It suffered approximately 22% of the Navy's total combat deaths. 1 in 5 American submariners who went to sea in the Pacific during the war did not come home. Of the 288 American submarines that conducted war patrols, 52 were lost, with most or all of their crews. The mathematics of submarine warfare were unforgiving in a way that surface warfare was not. A surface ship that was damaged could often still float, could often still get some of its crew into the water, could often be rescued. A submarine that was critically damaged at depth had, in the overwhelming majority of cases, no equivalent option. The crew was either going to surface or they were not. There was very rarely a middle outcome.
Submariners knew this. They volunteered anyway. The pay was better. The food was better. Submarine crews ate the best food in the Navy as a deliberate policy to maintain morale in the most psychologically demanding branch of service. The camaraderie in a crew of 70 to 90 men who lived in extraordinarily close quarters for weeks at a time was intense in a way that surface ship service rarely produced. And the kill ratio, when American submarines got their equipment working properly, was extraordinary. American submarines, representing less than 2% of naval personnel, sank over 30% of all Japanese naval losses and approximately 60% of Japan's entire merchant marine fleet by tonnage. The submarine force strangled the Japanese supply lines that connected the home islands to the oil and raw materials of Southeast Asia. By 1945, Japan's merchant fleet had been reduced to a fraction of its pre-war tonnage, and a significant share of that destruction had been done by a relatively small number of submarines and crews.
Richard O'Kane's USS Tang was, by the autumn of 1944, the single most effective weapon in that campaign. Richard Hetherington O'Kane was 32 years old in October 1944. He was a Naval Academy graduate, an intense and aggressive officer who had served as executive officer under one of the most famous submarine captains of the early war, Dudley "Mush" Morton, on the USS Wahoo. O'Kane had absorbed Morton's aggressive philosophy of submarine warfare: close the range, attack on the surface at night when possible, take risks that more cautious commanders would not take, and had taken command of his own boat, the Tang, determined to apply that philosophy without restraint. The Tang's 5th war patrol, beginning in October 1944, would become the most successful single patrol by tonnage sunk of any American submarine in the entire war.
On the night of October 23rd, 24th, 1944, the Tang intercepted a Japanese convoy in the Formosa Strait, the body of water between Formosa, modern Taiwan, and the Chinese mainland, a critical choke point for Japanese shipping, moving troops and supplies between the home islands and the rest of the collapsing Japanese empire. O'Kane attacked on the surface, at night, in the aggressive style he had learned from Morton. Over the course of the night and the following evening, the Tang fired torpedo salvo into the convoy, sinking transport. The Japanese ships were carrying reinforcements desperately needed elsewhere in the collapsing Pacific perimeter. Each ship the Tang sank represented hundreds or thousands of Japanese soldiers who would never reach their intended battlefield. Soldiers who, had arrived, would have faced American Marines and soldiers in the brutal island campaigns still ahead in the war.
By the early morning hours of October 24th, O'Kane had fired 23 of his 24 torpedoes. 22 had found their targets, an almost impossibly high hit rate, a testament to both O'Kane's tactical skill and the fact that for once, the torpedoes themselves were behaving as designed. The 24th torpedo would not. To understand why the Tang's last torpedo turned back on its own ship, you have to understand one of the most disgraceful chapters in the history of American naval procurement: the Mark 14 torpedo scandal. The Mark 14 torpedo, the standard American submarine torpedo for most of the Pacific War, entered the war with not one, but multiple serious design defects that the Navy's Bureau of Ordnance was slow to acknowledge and slower to fix.
The first defect was depth keeping. Early war patrols reported torpedoes running significantly deeper than set, passing harmlessly under their targets. The Bureau of Ordnance initially dismissed these reports as the result of inexperienced crews or faulty observation. It took months of mounting evidence and the direct intervention of submarine commanders who began conducting their own field tests, firing torpedoes into fishing nets to measure actual running depth because the Bureau would not authorize a proper test, before the depth problem was acknowledged and corrected. The second defect was the magnetic exploder, a device designed to detonate the torpedo's warhead based on proximity to a ship's magnetic field rather than requiring direct contact, theoretically allowing the torpedo to explode beneath a ship's keel for maximum damage. The magnetic exploder was wildly unreliable, prone to both premature detonation and complete failure to detonate. It took until 1943, well over a year into the Pacific War, for the Navy to authorize submarine crews to disable the magnetic exploders and rely solely on contact detonation.
The contact exploder, it then emerged, had its own defect. The firing pin mechanism, when a torpedo struck a target at a precisely perpendicular angle, the ideal textbook attack angle that submarine crews were trained to achieve, frequently failed to fire. Submarine commanders reported, with mounting fury, watching their torpedoes strike enemy ships dead center and simply fail to explode. It took further months of investigation and further loss of American submarines and crews who had fired their torpedoes and warned the enemy of their position without achieving a kill before this defect too was corrected. By 1943 and 1944, most of the Mark 14's major defects had been addressed. The torpedo that the Tang was firing in October 1944 was, by the standards of the earlier war, a substantially improved weapon. But there was one more problem that was rarer, harder to diagnose, and far less publicly acknowledged than the depth and detonation issues.
Under certain conditions that naval investigators would spend years trying to fully characterize, a small percentage of Mark 14 torpedoes exhibited a gyroscopic steering failure that caused them to veer off their set course. In the worst documented cases, the torpedo would execute what submariners grimly called a circular run, turning back through a wide arc that could, if the firing submarine had not moved sufficiently from the firing position, bring the torpedo back toward the vessel that had launched it. This was not a theoretical risk. The USS Tullabee was lost in March 1944, almost certainly to one of her own circling torpedoes, with only one survivor out of a crew of 80. The USS Tang, in October 1944, would become the second confirmed instance. The Navy's Bureau of Ordnance was aware by 1944 that circular runs were a documented and recurring hazard. The internal correspondence on the subject, much of which would not become fully available to historians and the public until decades after the war, shows officers within the Bureau debating how much operational guidance to issue to submarine crews and how publicly to acknowledge the problem, weighing the operational necessity of continuing torpedo production and deployment against the risk to crews. The guidance that was issued was incomplete and was not always effectively communicated to commanding officers in the field. Richard O'Kane, one of the most aggressive and successful submarine captains in the Navy, fired his 24th torpedo on October 24, 1944, without full knowledge of how serious and how documented the circular run risk already was. The explosion that struck the Tang's stern killed instantly, or within minutes, most of the men stationed in the aft compartments. The maneuvering room, the after engine room,
the after torpedo room. These were experienced submarine crewmen, men who had been with O'Kane through the entire extraordinary patrol, who had spent 2 days flawlessly executing one of the most successful torpedo attacks in submarine history. They had no warning. The explosion came from their own weapon, fired moments before by their own ship, had a range that gave essentially no time to react. O'Kane, on the bridge at the moment of explosion, along with several other men who had been topside. The forward 2/3 of the Tang, separated from the flooding aft compartments by watertight doors that held, did not sink immediately. It settled to the bottom of the Formosa Strait, approximately 180 feet of water, with the forward torpedo room, control room, and cruise quarters still intact and still containing survivors. This is the part of the story that gets less attention than it deserves, because what happened next involved some of the most extraordinary and least known acts of individual courage and engineering improvisation of the entire submarine war. Inside the sunken forward section of the Tang, approximately 30 men were alive. They were on the bottom of the Formosa Strait, in darkness, with their air supply finite and depleting, in a hull that had taken catastrophic damage and could fail further at any moment. In enemy-controlled waters, where Japanese patrol vessels were actively searching for survivors of the convoy attack the Tang had just conducted.
They had one option for escape: the Momsen lung. The Momsen lung was a primitive, self-contained breathing apparatus developed in the 1930s by Charles Momsen, designed to allow submarine crew members to make a free ascent from a sunken submarine using a small rebreather device that scrubbed carbon dioxide from exhaled air, allowing a swimmer to breathe during a slow, controlled ascent to the surface. It had been standard submarine equipment for years. It had been trained on in drills by virtually every American submarine crew. It had almost never been used in an actual combat sinking, because almost no American submarine crew that sank in combat survived in a condition to use it. The Tang situation, a forward section intact, on the bottom at a depth shallow enough that escape was theoretically possible, with survivors organized enough to attempt it, was almost unique in the submarine war. The procedure required flooding the forward torpedo room to equalize pressure with the outside sea, then opening an escape hatch, then individual men using the Momsen lung to make a free ascent through 180 feet of black water in darkness, at night, in the open ocean, with Japanese vessels known to be in the area. 13 men attempted the escape from the forward torpedo room. 8 reached the surface alive. The conditions inside the flooding compartment, in the dark, with men's nerve and physical endurance tested in ways that training drills in a calm harbor could never fully replicate, defeated some of the strongest and most experienced men on the crew. Some lost consciousness during the ascent. Some became disoriented and could not find the hatch. Some simply could not make themselves go through with an escape procedure that required deliberately flooding the compartment they were sheltering in and trusting a piece of 1930s breathing equipment to keep them alive through 10 stories of black water pressure. The 8 men who reached the surface from the forward torpedo room, combined with O'Kane and several others who had been thrown clear at the moment of the explosion, brought the total number of survivors to 13 out of a crew of 87. They spent the rest of the night in the water, in the Formosa Strait, supporting each other, waiting for daylight, with no certainty of rescue and the active risk of Japanese patrol vessels in the area. At dawn, Japanese vessels, some of the same patrol craft that had been part of the convoy the Tang had spent 2 days destroying, found the survivors in the water. They were taken prisoner. What followed was, by O'Kane's own later account and by the accounts of the other survivors, a brutal interrogation process. The Japanese naval officers questioning the survivors had pieced together,
from the survivors' own submarine and from the scale of the convoy destruction over the previous 2 days, that they had captured the crew of the submarine responsible for one of the most devastating single attacks of the naval war in that sector. O'Kane and his men were beaten. They were held in degrading conditions. They were transported eventually to a prisoner of war camp in Japan, where they would spend the remainder of the war, nearly a year, in conditions of deliberate mistreatment that specifically targeted them, by the survivors' accounts, because their captors knew exactly how much damage the Tang had done and held its surviving crew personally responsible. O'Kane survived the camp. He was liberated in 1945 at the end of the war, badly malnourished and having endured sustained physical abuse, but alive.
He received the Medal of Honor for the Tang's final patrol, for the extraordinary tactical achievement of the attack on the Japanese convoy, an action that was assessed and decorated independently of how the patrol had ended. The full story of how it had ended was a different matter. For years after the war, the official U.S. Navy accounts of the Tang's loss were vague. This was not unique to the Tang. Several American submarine losses during the war were officially attributed to causes that post-war investigation, when it eventually happened, often substantially revised. But the Tang's case had a specific institutional sensitivity that went beyond ordinary after-action ambiguity, acknowledging clearly and publicly that the Navy's most successful submarine of the war, commanded by a man who would receive the Medal of Honor, had been sunk by a malfunction in the Navy's own torpedo, a malfunction that internal correspondence showed officers had been aware of and had not fully resolved or adequately warned commanding officers about, was an admission with implications beyond the Tang specifically.
It implicated the broader Mark 14 torpedo scandal, the depth-running failures, the magnetic exploder failures, the contact detonator failures, that the Navy had already spent the war trying to manage quietly rather than acknowledge as the systemic procurement and testing failure that it was. It raised uncomfortable questions about how many other American submarine losses, officially attributed to enemy action or unknown causes, might have actually been caused by American ordnance malfunctioning against American crews. The full technical investigation into the Tang's loss, establishing with confidence that a circular running torpedo was the cause, was completed but was not made fully public. Parts of the relevant records remained classified or were not actively publicized for years. Survivors of the Tang, including O'Kane himself, knew privately what had happened. They had lived through it. But the broader public, and for years much of the historical record available to researchers, treated the cause of the Tang's loss with an institutional vagueness that did not reflect what the survivors and the Navy's own internal investigators actually knew. It would take until the 1970s and 1980s, decades after the war, as broader Mark 14 torpedo records were progressively declassified, and as historians specializing in the submarine war pieced together the full technical picture, for the cause of the Tang's sinking to become clearly and publicly established as a circular running American torpedo, and for the broader pattern of how many submarine losses had likely shared this cause to become part of the standard historical record. Richard O'Kane himself, in his 1977 memoir, Clear the Bridge, provided one of the first detailed public accounts from a survivor's perspective of exactly what had happened, breaking, in his own careful and characteristically understated prose, decades of institutional vagueness about how the most successful submarine patrol of the war had ended. What happened to the USS Tang is, in one sense, a story about extraordinary individual courage, about Richard O'Kane's tactical brilliance in conducting the most successful submarine patrol of the Pacific War, about the 8 men who made a free ascent through 180 feet of dark water using equipment that had almost never been tested in real combat conditions, about a crew that endured capture, beatings, and a year of brutal captivity, and largely survived. But it is also a story about institutional failure and the specific kind of silence that follows when an institution's own weapon kills its own people. And the institution has reasons, operational, political, reputational, not to fully acknowledge what happened. The Mark 14 torpedo problem was not a single defect. It was a cascade of defects, identified over years, each one initially minimized or denied by the Bureau of Ordnance before mounting operational evidence forced acknowledgement and correction. The circular run defect was the last and least publicly acknowledged of these failures. It killed the crew of the Tullabee in March 1944. It crippled the Tang and killed most of her crew in October 1944. The Navy's own internal records suggest officers were aware of the circular run risk well before the Tang's loss. The guidance that should have followed from that awareness, clear, mandatory operational procedures for submarine commanders to follow after firing, specific evasive maneuvers, explicit warnings about the conditions under which the risk was highest, was incomplete and inconsistently communicated.
Richard O'Kane, one of the most skilled and successful submarine commanders the United States Navy produced in the entire war, was not fully informed of a danger his own service already understood. His ship paid for that gap between institutional knowledge and operational guidance, with 68 of his 87 men. Richard O'Kane died in 1994, 81 years old, having lived nearly half a century after the night his own torpedo sank his own ship. He spent much of those decades working in various ways to ensure the full and accurate record of what happened to the Tang and to the broader submarine force was told. His 1977 memoir remains one of the most important first-hand accounts of the submarine war ever published, written by a man who had every institutional incentive to let the comfortable, vague version of his ship's loss stand uncorrected, and who chose instead to tell the precise and uncomfortable truth.
The 9 men who escaped the sunken Tang through the Momsen lung procedure, 8 from the forward torpedo room, plus those thrown clear at the moment of impact, represent one of the only successful uses of that escape equipment in actual wartime combat conditions in the entire war. Their escape, executed in darkness, at depth, under the threat of Japanese discovery, by men who had trained for exactly this scenario without ever expecting to actually need it, remains one of the most remarkable submarine survival stories on record. 68 men did not survive. Most of them died in the seconds after the explosion, in the flooded aft compartments, with no warning and no chance. They were killed by the weapon their own Navy gave them, on the final torpedo of the most successful patrol any American submarine fired in the entire war. Because an institution that knew about a defect did not act on that knowledge quickly enough or clearly enough to save them. The records were not erased by malice. They were erased, or more precisely, kept deliberately incomplete, by an institutional instinct towards self-protection that is not unique to any one Navy or any one war. It took decades, and the courage of survivors like Richard O'Kane, willing to put the precise truth on the record over their own service's preference for comfortable ambiguity, before the full story of the Tang could be told. This has been an attempt to tell it. If this investigation gave you something to think about, hit the like button. It keeps stories like this visible, the stories that institutions preferred to leave vague, that took survivors decades to tell fully, that deserve to be part of the record the way they actually happened. Subscribe if you want the next chapter. The submarine war in the Pacific is full of stories like this one. Extraordinary courage, institutional failure, and silence that took decades to break. The USS Tang fired the most effective torpedo salvo of the Pacific War. Her last torpedo killed her own crew. Remember both halves of that sentence. The Navy, for a long time, preferred you only remember the first.